Bezat Hashem, today we're beginning Masechet Sanhedrin, and we'll start with the Mishnah in Bet Amud Aleph. Our learning today, and to continue, should be as a refuah shleima for Yaakov ben Dinah, a good friend. Bezat Hashem, our learning should be a zechut for him, and he should have a complete and total recovery, bikarov, soon and speedily. The Mishnah that we begin with in Masechet Sanhedrin on Bet Amud Aleph has two sections. Bezat Hashem, the first section we'll learn about is the distinction between which types of cases require each of the three different levels of courts that we'll learn about in the Mishnah, which require a 3-person Beit Din, which require 23, and which perhaps require a 71, the Sanhedrin Agadol, which we'll speak about in a moment, to adjudicate. The second section we'll deal with is the sources for these types of Batei Dinim, these levels of courts, where we know them from in the Psukim, and at the end of the Mishnah, a related point to that. So just as means of introduction here, to understand what this Mishnah is going to tell us, we know whenever there's any sort of a court case, there's distinctions, obviously. You have civil law and you have capital law. There's different sorts of court cases that could occur, and then we have Jewish courts that would deal with these. There are levels of Jewish courts, though. It's interesting, we're starting on Parashat Yitro. Actually, Yitro, the father-in-law of Moshe Rabbeinu, was the one who gave the advice to Moshe about creating different levels of courts, in a similar sense, actually. But we're going to see in this Mishnah, there are 3 levels of courts that could adjudicate, that can deal with different types of cases or different types of claims, as we'll see in the Mishnah. There's the lowest level court, which is a 3-person Beit Din. Meaning you have three rabbis, 3 people who can judge certain court cases, which we'll get to. The second level is a 23-person Beit Din. And we'll see also, that already gets a little more serious. They could already judge capital cases. That's already what's called Sanhedrin Ktana. It's a lower level Sanhedrin, but they could actually adjudicate scenarios that would include capital punishment, meaning putting people to death. And then we have the highest level, which is the Sanhedrin Agadol. It's the Great Sanhedrin, which was the 71-person Sanhedrin that existed in the Beit HaMikdash. That was the highest level. It was like the Supreme Court. And they would judge, as we'll see also, the higher level, the more significant court cases, which we'll get to in the Mishnah. Let's begin in the Mishnah. And the Mishnah tells us, Dine Mamonot Bishlosha, the cases of Mamonot, cases of monetary claims, or monetary scenarios, civil law is done by a court of 3. Means you can have the lowest level of court of 3 people. That's sufficient in order to judge monetary cases. Continues the Mishnah, Gizelot v'chavalot bishlosha. Cases of gizelot. Now gizela is theft, but it's a specific kind of theft in the sense that it's overt, out in the open. Somebody strong-arms another person and steals what they have. So in order to adjudicate that scenario, to resolve that, you can have a 3-person Beit Din, as well as chavalot. Chavalot is where you damage somebody physically. Physically you damage somebody. So the Mishnah says in these 2 scenarios of Gzelot and Chavalot, you can have a 3-person court adjudicate that scenario. The Gemara is going to deal with the fact that it starts off saying Dine Mamonot in a general sense, and then it gives these 2 particular cases of Gzelot and Chavalot. We'll have to figure out if there's a general introduction, particular cases, or if these are 3 different scenarios. We'll see that in the Gemara. Continues the Mishnah. Nezek v'chatzi nezek, if it's scenarios that could include full payments, nezek, payments of damages, as well as chatzi nezek, as well as half damages. So there's different scenarios. This is discussed at length in Masechet Baba Kama, actually, where a person's animal damages another. So if it's a tam, for example, you would pay chatzi nezek, half damages. If it was a muad, perhaps you'll pay nezek shalem, complete damages. But in any of these cases, as well as tashlume kefel, the payment of double payment. And what is that? If someone steals from another, now we're talking about gneva. he steals surreptitiously and in a hidden sort of fashion. So the halacha is when he's brought to court, he not only has to pay back the principal value of what he stole, but he also has to pay kefel, a double portion of that, v'tashlume arba'a v'chamisha, as well as the payments of 4 and 5 times. This is a special parsha in the Torah where it talks about if somebody steals particularly a sheep or an ox. In these two scenarios, if he would sell it or slaughter it, the halacha would be he would also have to pay back not only again principal, but he'd have to pay back 4 or 5 times as well. All of these types of cases are judged bishlosha, with a court of 3 judges. Continues the Mishnah, ha'ones v'amifateh, if a man rapes a girl, or if he seduces a girl, we're talking about a na'ara betula, a young girl who is a virgin, a betula, and the Torah tells us there's a certain penalty leveled against the man who does this. Rashi says it's the penalty of 50 silver coins. That's what's going to happen in order to pay for the damages that he caused. V'hamotzi shem ra, or if someone casts negative allegations against the woman that he just married, again, there's a certain penalty associated with such claims. He says that she was not a betula like he expected, and it's important to understand in context, it used to be that there would be kiddushin, the first stage of marriage. They'd wait roughly 12 months, and then they would do nisu'in, the second stage of marriage, or consummation of the marriage. If he claims that in between those 2 time periods she went and slept with someone else, and thus she's not a betula, so he's leveling a pretty serious allegation against her, because she's already considered a married woman, and if it's true, she's chayab mita. So the halacha is, again, he has to pay a certain amount if he's making this up and it's not true. And how do you adjudicate these types of cases? Ones mefateh motzi shemra bishlosha divrei Rabbi Meir. So Rabbi Meir says this would be again with a 3-person court. But the Chachamim disagree here, because they say motzi shemra, this last case of motzi shemra, where he levels these allegations against the woman that he just married, be'esrim v'shlosha, you need a court of 23 judges to deal with this. As we mentioned before, 23 judges generally dealt with scenarios that were capital, that could include putting people to death. So why is that necessary? Because associated with this is dinei nefashot, is capital scenarios. Maybe she was mizana. If she really did stray from under her husband, she would be put to death. So therefore, you need a court of 23. 3 is not sufficient in this case. Continues the Mishnah, makot, if there's a scenario that a person is being judged and he may be liable to makot, for lashes in court, bishlosha, requires a court of 3 people. Mishum Rabbi Yishmael amru esrim bishlosha. In the name of Rabbi Yishmael, it was said you need a court of 23. 3 is not sufficient, and we'll see in the Gemara exactly what this debate is. Let's continue. Now, there's a concept of intercalation. What is intercalation? So intercalating, calculating in the year. Now, what is the idea here? So there's actually 2 points here. There's ibur hachodesh and there's ibur hashana. Ibur hachodesh means that we know in reality the months in Judaism, really a full cycle of the moon, which would be a full month, is really 29 and a half days, roughly, a little more, a little less, but it's 29 and a half days. Now, you can't have a month that's 29 and a half days. A month has to be either 29 or has to be 30. So Beit Din, back in the day, was tasked with the job to decide which months were going to be 29 days, which months were going to be 30 days. Now, they would determine that based on different factors. In addition, when you talk about intercalating the year, this actually, we're coming up now to Adar and Nisan, this comes up in regards to keeping seasons as they're meant to be. We know that the solar year, the calendar that is driven by the sun is 365 days. Let's say roughly 365 days. The lunar year, however, is roughly 354 days with a discrepancy of 11 days. Based on that discrepancy, seasons can get out of whack. For us, that's a big issue because Pesach, for example, is supposed to fall out in Chag HaAviv. It's meant to be in the spring. But if there is such a discrepancy for long enough, it can cause Pesach to not fall out in the spring as it's meant to. So therefore, Beit Din was tasked in order to keep these seasons lining up with the dates of the Chagim, etc., as they're meant to be. They would add an extra month every couple of years, which was in the form of an extra Adar, which we actually have this year. thus keeping the seasons and the chagim in line as they're meant to. So now, how many judges were necessary to do both Ibur HaChodesh and Ibur HaShana? Says the Mishnah, Ibur HaChodesh Bishlosha, Ibur HaShana Bishlosha Divrei Rabbi Meir. Rabbi Meir says both the task of intercalating the month or the year was able to be done with, Rabbi Meir says, with a court of 3. Rabbi Shimon Gamliel disagrees. Bishlosha matchilin. He says like this: you start with 3. However, the discussion, the ensuing conversations between the judges to argue, to determine how it should be done, is with 5. V'gomrin b'shiva, and they conclude the process with 7. V'im gamru b'gimel, if they finished off with 3 me'uberet, it's still considered effective. We'll see in the Gemara exactly what this debate is based on as well. Continues the Mishnah. Smichat zekenim. Smichat zekenim is a unique scenario, which is as follows. If the Sanhedrin paskins that a certain behavior is acceptable to perform, and then a majority of the Jewish people engage in that behavior, and it turns out they were wrong, and they led the Jewish people astray, the Sanhedrin is required to bring a special korban called Par Ha'elem Davar Shel Tzibur. Now, before bringing that korban, some of the Sanhedrin needed to do smicha. Now, smicha here doesn't mean rabbinical ordination. Smicha here means you would lean on the animal before it was sacrificed. It's part of the avodah. So how many of the Sanhedrin had to lean on it? Smichat zekenim, so the leaning on that animal by the zkenim, and tuv arifat egla, as well as decapitating the egla, the calf. Now, what is that referring to? This is a different halacha altogether. Halacha is, if a body is found, a Jewish body is found between 2 cities, somewhere on the road, and we don't know how he was killed, we don't know who killed him. So there's a certain element of responsibility that the courts have, and the Sanhedrin would come and measure which city is this dead body closest to. After measuring which city is this dead body closest to, there would be a procedure that occurred in that city that it was closest to, because we would level the complaint or the issue against that city to some degree, and they would do a process that would relinquish their responsibility. It would be a kapara of some sort. Now, that measuring was also done by some of the Sanhedrin. So the Mishnah tells us again, leaning on that Par Ha'elem Davar Shel Tzibur, as well as decapitating this calf, Bishlosha, was done with a court of 3, with 3 judges of the Sanhedrin. Divrei Rabbi Shimon, these are the words of Rabbi Shimon. Continues the Mishnah. Rabbi Yehuda Omer b'chamisha. Rabbi Yehuda says, no, actually, you need 5 of the Sanhedrin to be involved in this behavior, in these 2 activities. 3 is not sufficient. Now, moving on to a completely different area of halacha now. Chalitza. Chalitza is a scenario where you have 2 brothers. One brother, unfortunately, passes away without children. The other brother has a mitzvah to marry his brother's wife after his brother passed away. That's called yibum. If he chooses not to do yibum and marry her, so then he has the opportunity to do chalitza. Chalitza is to send her away. V'hami'unin. Now, mi'unin is refusal. Refusal is as follows. Minat Torah, based on Torah law, a father is given the ability, the koach, to marry off his daughter who is a kitana, who's under bat mitzvah age. If the father is no longer on the scene, this doesn't happen today, obviously, but if the father is no longer on the scene, the Rabbanan gave that ability over to the girl's mother or brother, again, while she's a kitana. But in order to show that this is not a deoraita marriage, when the mother or brother marry off that girl, and it's merely rabbinic, they also gave that girl the ability of opt-out. Until she becomes a gedolah, she has the ability to refuse. She could say, I don't want to be married to this guy, and walk out. Now, these 2 processes of chalitza and mi'un, bishlosha, they require a beit din of 3 people to be there when it happens. Neter avai umaaser sheni she'ein damav yedu'in bishlosha. Now, a completely unrelated area of halacha, which is neter avai, which is the fruits that are produced on the 4th year of a tree's production, which need to be consumed in Yerushalayim, as well as Maaser Sheni. Maaser Sheni is in the 1st, 2nd, 4th, and 5th year of the Shemitah cycle. The Maaser, the tithe of Maaser Sheni was taken off, and those fruits were also eaten in Yerushalayim. Now, generally, you could take those fruits, transfer it onto money, take the money to Yerushalayim, buy food there, and eat that in Yerushalayim. But in a scenario she'ein damav yedu'in, where you don't know how much those fruits are worth, Rashi says they began to spoil. So you can't compare this to something in the market, and therefore its market value is unclear. So what has to happen now is bishlosha. You need a court of 3 judges to assess its value, and then you could transfer that onto money and take that money and consume it in Yerushalayim. Hayakteshot bishlosha. Similarly, if you consecrated something and now you want to redeem it from being part of hektish, being owned by Beit HaMikdash, you need 3 judges in order to assess its value so that there's an appropriate deconsecration. Ha'erachin ha'metaltalin bishlosha, as well as erachin. Now, erachin is generally if somebody pledges the value of a person. Movable erachin, we'll have to see in the Gemara what this refers to. Bishlosha. In order to fulfill it properly, it requires 3 people. We'll see in the Gemara what that refers to. Rabbi Yehuda says, Echad mehen kohen. So Rabbi Yehuda argues and he says like this: both in the case of deconsecrating hektish or erachina metaltalin, in order to assess its value, one of the 3 judges has to be a kohen. Tanakama doesn't say that's necessary. Rabbi Yehuda says it is. V'akarkaot. Now, if you're talking about consecrated land that you want to deconsecrate, in order to assess its value, tish'a ve'kohen, you need 10 people. 9 of them could not be kohenim, but 1 of them would have to be a kohen. In order to assess its value, you need a kohen involved in that as well. V'adam keyotze bahen. And similarly, if you're deconsecrating a person who was consecrated, you need 10 people, 1 of them being a kohen. We'll see in the Gemara exactly what this deconsecration is all about. Until now, in the Mishnah, we've discussed scenarios where a court of 3 is sufficient or necessary. Now we're moving on to the next level. When is a court of 23 necessary? And these are all cases of capital punishment, where a person might, or a person we'll see, maybe an animal, could be liable to be put to death. That's where you need a court of 23. Dinei nefashot be'esrim. Continues the Mishnah, when it comes to capital cases, you need be'esrim v'shlosha, 23-person court. The Mishnah continues with illustrations. Roveya is if an animal had relations with a woman. So an animal had relations with a woman. Now the woman, for sure, will require a 23-person court to adjudicate her case, because that's one of the things the Torah says, if it's true, she's put to death. But in regards to the animal could also be put to death. So in order to deal with the animal, you also need a court case of 23 judges. Vahanirva, and the same idea, but nirva is where a man sleeps with an animal. In such a scenario, again, the man and the animal require a court of 23, in order to adjudicate the case. Where do we find this idea? Because Shene'emar, the pasuk says, "V'haragta et ha'isha ve'et ha'beima." It says you should kill the woman and the animal. Meaning, in a scenario, a woman sleeps with an animal, right? Not encouraged, obviously. The halacha is that both the woman and the animal, it's a hekish, it compares the 2, are put to death. They're the same. Just as she would require a 23-person court, the animal would as well, in order to be put to death. The Omer, and furthermore, it says regarding a man who sleeps with an animal, it also compares him to the animal, that also, just as he requires 23, the animal he slept with would also require a 23-person court in order to be put to death. Similarly, continues the Mishnah, shor niskal, a shor, an ox that is to be put to death. If an ox kills a person, it's chayav mita, it has to be stoned. So in order to determine if it's chayav mita, be'esrim v'shlosha, there has to be a 23-person court that can determine that. Shene'emar, we find the pasuk says, hashor yisakel, the ox is stoned, V'gam ba'alav yumat, and also its owners die. Rashi says, we know the owners don't die actually. If my ox kills somebody, I'm not chayav mita. So these are extra words. What does it teach us? It compares the owner dying and the shore being stoned. Kimitat ba'alim, just as in general, if a person is to be put to death, you need a court of 23. Kach mitat ashor, so too is the death of the ox. You need a court of 23 in order to put the ox to death. Similarly, it's not only if an ox kills somebody that you need a court of 23, but also other animals. Haze'ev, if a wolf kills somebody. V'ha'ari, a lion. V'hadov, a bear. V'hanamer, the leopard. Habardalis. Now, the bardalis is unclear exactly what it is. I saw, Rashi just says chayahi, it's some sort of a wild animal. I saw there's different explanations given. The Art Scroll footnote says it's a polecat, which I believe is a type of ferret or skunk. Others say perhaps it's a type of bobcat. Either way, a wild animal of some sort, v'anachash, or a snake, all of these things, if they kill a person, mitatan be'esrim v'shlosha, their death would be administered by a court that judges them of 23. Rabbi Eliezer says, Kol hakodem lahargan zacha, anybody that kills them first has been merited. Now we'll see exactly in the Gemara what Rabbi Eliezer is arguing about. Rabbi Akiva omer mitatan be'esrim v'shlosha, their death is with 23. We'll see how Rabbi Akiva is arguing on the first opinion in the Gemara. Be'ezrat Hashem, we'll see that as well. Now we're moving up to the final level. So far we discussed the courts of 3, what they adjudicate, the courts of 23, what they adjudicate. Now we're moving up to a court of 71, which is the Sanhedrin Agadol, that sat in Yerushalayim in the Beit HaMikdash, and they judged the following. Let's continue. Ein danin lo et hashevet velo et hanavi hasheker. You're not allowed to judge a shevet. A shevet means if the majority of a shevet, Rashi says, served avodah zarah b'mezid. They worshipped idols intentionally. Nor can you judge navi sheker, a false prophet who prophesizes in the name of Hashem, but he's false. Velo et kohen gadol, or if a kohen gadol commits something that would incur capital punishment, you can't judge any of these scenarios. El al pi beit din shel shivim ve'echad, only with the court of 71 in Yerushalayim in the Beit HaMikdash, as we mentioned. So these are more serious, obviously, requiring the highest level court, the Supreme Court in Judaism. You're not allowed to go out to a voluntary war. Rashi says a voluntary war is any battle the Jews would wage besides for the wars in the days of Yoshua when they conquered Eretz Yisrael. Right, when Yeshua crossed over with the Jews, conquering the land of Israel. So you can't go out to a voluntary war unless this was by the word of the 71-person court, the Sanhedrin Agadol. Now the area of Yerushalayim, and particularly the area of the Beit HaMikdash, had high-level sanctity. If they wanted to add on to the city, they wanted to expand its borders, or, as we'll see, the Azarot, the courtyards in the Beit HaMikdash, they needed the 71-person court to engage in this, because that's essentially increasing Kedusha, which is a significant thing. Ein mosifin al ha'ir, you cannot add on to Yerushalayim, ve'al azarot, or expand the borders of the azarot, the courtyards of Beit HaMikdash, el al pi beit din shel shivim ve'echad, again, without the word of the 71-person court. Now, Eino sin Sanhedriot l'shvatim, you're not allowed to make a 23-person court for tribes throughout Israel. It means if you wanted to set up specific courts to deal with capital punishment in other shvatim, you're only allowed to set up that court el al pi beit din shel shivim ve'echad, with the word of the 71-person Sanhedrin. There is a halacha, as we're about to see, called irani dachat. Irani dachat, where the inhabitants of a city, the majority of them worshipped avodah zarah, and we deal with it in a very strict way. We destroy the city. So the Mishnah says, Ein osin, we do not do irani dachat, this case of irani dachat, el al pi beit din shel shivim ve'echad, we only adjudicate it with the court of 71. Now on this note that we introduced irani dachat, we have a couple of related halachot of irani dachat. Ein osin irani dachat b'sfar, we are not allowed to make a city into irani dachat and destroy it if it's a border city of Eretz Yisrael. Seemingly the logic here is, because if you would, it would create a weakness in Eretz Yisrael against its enemies, now that a border city is destroyed and is fallible to being attacked by enemies. Velo shalosh, nor are you allowed to make 3 cities, we'll see in the Gemara if it means in a row, but 3 cities into irani dachat, avalosin achat o shtayim. But you could paskin that 1 or 2 cities are irani dachat and they have to be destroyed. Now, moving on to the second section of the Mishnah now continues to tell us actually the idea of these different levels of courts and the sources for these courts. So the Mishnah tells us, Sanhedrin Gdola Haita Shel Shivim Ve'echad. The highest level court was of 71, as we mentioned, which we call Sanhedrin, the colloquial. Viktana, the lower level Sanhedrin, meaning the Sanhedrin that could still deal with capital cases but wasn't 3, Shel Esrim V'Shalosh was 23. How do we know that the great Sanhedrin in Yerushalayim in the Beit HaMikdash was 71, Shel Shivim Ve'echad? Shene'emar, so the Gemara tells us it's based on a pasuk. The pasuk says that HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe when he needs help dealing with the Jewish people, Esfa li shivim ish miziknei Yisrael, gather for me 70 elders from the elders of Israel. Now we know he gathered 70 people, Moshe al gabeyan, and he was on top of them, Moshe. So you have 70 plus Moshe is 71. So you see the court that was assembled originally, it's in the Sefer Bamidbar, when it talks about Moshe requiring assistance, that was of 71. So you see, that's the ultimate court of the Sanhedrin. Rabbi Yehuda says, he argues, he says Shiv'im. No. The Sanhedrin Agadol was 70 because really Moshe is not included in the count of Sanhedrin Agadol, and therefore it's 70 as is illustrated in the Psukim. We'll discuss this in the Gemara. Continues the Mishnah. How do we know that the lower level Sanhedrin of 23? How do we know that it's 23 people? Shene'emar, as the pasuk says, v'shaftu ha'ida v'itzilu ha'ida. It says when it talks about capital punishment, it says, firstly, it says, the shaftu ha'ida, the congregation, keyword being eida, shall judge, which is in the negative sense, convict. V'hitzilu ha'ida, and it also says, they shall save, they shall acquit. So it refers to a group of eida convicting and a group of eida that's acquitting, that's saying he's innocent. We know, as we'll see in a moment, eida means 10 people. So from the psukim it would imply, Eida shofetet ve'eida matzelet, that a group called Eida can judge, can convict, and also another group is necessary in order to save. So it's 10 plus 10 because Eida means 10. Harei kanesrim, the psukim are implying that this lower level Sanhedrin is 20. Now hold your thought about 23, we'll get there in a minute. Before we get there, the Gemara says, how do we know the word Eida refers to 10 people, as we've been illustrating? It says by the Meraglim. We know when the spies went off to Israel to spy out the land, they had nefarious intention. They came back and they said a very negative report, Lashon Hara, about Eretz Yisrael, besides for 2. Besides, for 2 out of the 12, Yoshua and Kalev refrained from doing that. So the pasuk says, Hashem says, Ad matai le'eida ra'a azot. Until when will there be this negative eida, this negative group, this negative congregation? But we know not included in the 12 of negative, because Kalev and Yoshua didn't say negative things. Yatzu, Yoshua and Kalev, they weren't included. So you see 10 people said negative things and they're called eida. Therefore, you see Eida is 10. So if it says Eida in terms of convicting and acquitting, you see that there's 20. Continues the Mishnah. How do you know to include another 3? Meaning, you've told me then, based on what we just said, that there are 20. How do you know that there's another 3 that are also included? Because the pasuk says, by implication of the verse that says, it says, you shall not follow the majority to convict. L'raot means to do bad, but it means you don't follow a majority in terms of convicting a person. So Shomeani, based on that, I would deduce she'ayeh mahem l'tova, that you could follow a majority of the judges if it comes to acquitting, to doing good to a person. So if it's already implied by that, says the Mishnah, if so, why does the pasuk have to meforash clearly say you shall follow a majority to do good, to tilt in the side of favor? Why does it have to say that if we know already based on implication that in the side of favor you do tilt for the majority? So the Gemara answers, actually based on the implication, there's a distinction when you tilt in the side of favor, or if you're tilting, or if you're paskening in the side of negativity, of convicting. What is the difference? Lo k'hatiyatecha letova, hatiyatecha l'ra'ah. That the idea of tilting in the side of favor, to acquit somebody, to say someone's innocent, is not the same as convicting somebody in the negative sense. What does it mean? In order to say somebody's innocent and he's off scot-free, you just need a majority of one judge saying that he's innocent over those who say he's guilty. But when it comes to making somebody convicted in the negative sense, so then al pi shnayim, it's a different sort of a system of tilting. In order to convict him, the imbalance has to be 2 people. That's what the psukim are telling us. Which means now, turning to Bet Amud Bet, now we've shown that you need at least 2 more people, because what we're essentially saying is, now you need another 2 in order to create this reality that there's 22 people, essentially. That there's now the ability to have at least 2. So now we're up to 72 judges on the Sanhedrin Agadol. But the Mishnah continues, Bet Amud Bet, Ve'ein Beit Din Shakul. Now, you can't have a court that is equal, as Rashi explains, because if a court was equal, then you couldn't have a scenario where based on one judge, you would be able to tilt in the side of favor, because it would be possible then, if it's 72, that you would have a perfect split, making it that you can't tilt in the side of favor. So Mosifin Alein Od Echad, therefore you have to add on one more, Hareka Nesri Mishlosha. So thus we conclude that you have to have a total of 23 in the sense, means originally we started off with 20, based on Ida, based on the fact that you need another 2 in order to tilt in the side of negativity, so we added another 2. In order to make it that it's not equal, because then you can't tilt in the side of positivity with just 1. It has to be an odd number. Therefore, you need a total of 23. Logically, you add one more person, concluding that the lower Sanhedrin has to be comprised of 23 people. The Kama concludes the Mishnah, and this is really a unrelated but separate point. How many people have to be in a city in order to make it fitting to have a Sanhedrin? Meaning, you can't just establish a court of 23 in any city. You have to have a certain number qualifying that city as sufficient enough to have a 23-person court. So the Gemara says, Me'ah ve'esrim. There has to be a total of 120 people in that city. Now, that's not so many people, obviously, but that would make it fitting, ra'oi, qualified, to have a court of 23 people established there. Rabbi Nechemia says you need more. He says, Matayim v'shloshim, you need 230 keneged sarei asarot. Now, why does he say that? He says because it has to parallel sarei asarot. Rashi quotes actually in Yitro, the way we learned in Parashat Yitro, where it talks about courts of 10 people, is that the lowest possible position of judges is if you have one judge adjudicating or presiding over at least 10 people. So therefore, in order to establish a court of 23, there has to be that each one of those 23 can theoretically reside over 10 people, resulting in that city needing to have 230 people to establish a Sanhedrin of 23 in that city, in that town. Okay, we're going to stop here at the Gemara. We did Bet Amud Aleph today. Be'ezrat Hashem, we're stopping here towards the top of Bet Amud Bet. Be'ezrat Hashem, we'll pick up tomorrow with Bet Amud Bet and continue to discuss the Reisha of this Mishnah, the distinction between, like we said, Mamonot, Gzelot, and Chavalot. With this, we'll stop. Everyone have a wonderful day. All the best.